So we're going to talk about GDPR, we're going to talk about GDPR compliance, we're going to talk about what happens next, and then we have a bit of time for closing remarks and Q&A. So just a few words about myself. I am the current CEO and a partner in Fintricity, and I have a first degree in insurance economics and a second degree in business IT management. So that makes me clearly more the business person than the technologist. So if you have specific questions on how we're actually seeing technology supporting GDPR initiatives or underlying technology, I can answer it on a high level. But if you have business questions, I'm more than happy to go into a little bit more detail. So just a few words about Fintricity and who we are, so that you know where we're coming from. And the whole idea where we're coming from is around agile digital transformation. Agile digital transformation because we recognize the fact that whatever you set out to do today, you can't just keep on track for the next 2 or 3 years. You can't set up a program or a project to aim at a target 2 years from now and then expect everything to run its course and the target still be the same. With the fast changes that we see in business, we're discovering that you need to take stock very, very frequently and look at your current status quo, and as it changes, also at the targets where you're aiming at in terms of your project outcomes. That's why we use the word admittedly slightly overused word agile. We can call it nimble or something else, but basically this all means that you need to take stock and reassess where you're heading. And then we're trying to make sure that this all is in the business context and we actually look at the bigger picture. So in short, we innovate, transform, enable, and we've done that since 15 years. We've got clients all over the place. We have clients in the Middle East, in continental Europe, in Northern Europe, such as the UK and elsewhere. And we have been working on anything around data and digital, since several decades actually. So that's just the length in which I'm going to go about Fintricity. If you have any more questions or would like to see some additional thoughts or some of our portfolio, please visit our website at fintricity.com or just send me an email at florian.kruger@fintricity.com, and we're happy to support you with that, obviously. So let's get started with the GDPR from a topic perspective as an overview. And most of you will probably know what GDPR is, otherwise you wouldn't be here today. Many of which will probably have been scaremongered into the necessity of doing something, but then there's scaremongering on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's actually a real need to do something. So if you look at the deadline, which is looming at the 25th of May 2018, we're not talking about several years you have to be compliant, but we're talking about several months to be compliant. And the compliance doesn't only mean that you need to be compliant on the 25th, but it actually then relates to all sorts of potential incidents that might happen after the 25th. So you have to have your ducks in a row, you act together, or otherwise any incident that occurs after the 25th might actually be quite expensive. It is considered to be the global high water mark because it is currently the most stringent data privacy law. Some might say that this only, or might think that this only applies to European companies, but any company that has any dealings in Europe will actually, and that will want to continue working within Europe, the European Union, will need to be compliant to this, or otherwise they might face prosecution and penalties. The penalties, as I'm sure you all know, are quite significant, and they are not just on some sort of profit margin in some region, because finally the regulators have understood that these can be shifted around. Profits can be shifted for tax reasons and for other reasons by just putting the IP elsewhere, as we all know. So they have agreed to make it dependent on the worldwide turnover of the group, and not anymore on how much did Apple do in Ireland last year, but actually how much did Apple as a whole make in profit or make in turnover actually last year. and they have this additional 20 million, which is then to say that 4% or 20 million, whichever is bigger. So it's going to be a significant fine, and they apply per incident. It's not a one-off and you get out of jail free card for the year. This is actually a recurring fine which you can incur a multitude of times. And just to know, we have worked with someone that held privacy quite at the heart of their operation, and they were looking back for the last half a year on the incidents that they would have had, and they found out that they probably had an incident that would have been classified as a GDPR incident once every other week, which is quite significant, and I wouldn't be surprised if it would be similar at most organizations. So the question is, who's impacted by GDPR? And I think many think that they might not be impacted by GDPR, such as, for example, an asset management company who primarily manages real estate, commercial real estate, that we've been talking with recently. And the commercial real estate managers said that they don't really worry too much because on the GDPR front, they only have very, very limited personal data because they're only dealing with about 30 or 40 large-scale asset classes, or assets actually. And the result of that conversation then was that we had to ask them what kind of assets they had when they said that they have, for example, in commercial real estate, they have shopping malls, and within the shopping malls they have CCTV, and we asked them where the CCTV data is stored and who actually manages it. It became clear quite quickly that they had the CCTV footage, they managed it, and everyone around the globe currently had access to it, which made it basically a breach every time somebody accesses it that shouldn't have accessed it, or shouldn't have the right to access it, or where there should be a plan in place that regulates what's happening with the information. So a company that is seemingly at first glance completely unimpacted, if that's a word, by GDPR, then quickly figures out that once they start looking at it, that this is actually something that really matters to them very much. Everybody holds EU personal information, EU citizens' personal information. It may be, for example, just to give you another example, that somebody uses his private email account to exchange information around the company, or exchange an NDA, or whatever, some sort of thing. It can be just a loose chat with somebody else from another company, or with a private client, and uses his private email account for that. That in itself is already a breach. If you're using Dropbox, or if you're allowing your employees to use Dropbox, if you're allowing your employees to use Box, or any of these cloud storage services, if you're allowing your employees to occasionally use their private email or to bring their own devices, which has become pretty much standard right now, all of these above will be considered a breach of the GDPR regulatory requirements, unless you have a plan in place and the stuff that we're going to talk about in a second. So you can be a photocopy manufacturer, you can be a telecom or whatever, whereas a telecom would be considered someone that has more exposure. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case depending on how you run your business. If a photocopy manufacturer, for example, takes digital images, stores them somewhere secure where all of his employees have access, and any of that makes it out into the cloud or in a private email inbox, that's the same thing. Just a word of advice there. So let me talk a little bit about how does that differ from the current data protection directive. And it is a revolution, because it dramatically increases the penalties, albeit it uses the same terminology. Much of it is updated for the digital age, which means that what we're going to see in a bit, and what we're going to talk about, is actually all now geared towards the capabilities and the new problem areas that arise. And It's a combination of lessons learned from the past, but it's also, and that makes it particularly challenging, taking some new considerations into account. And I say makes it particularly challenging because there is no gold standard. They're not saying this is how you have to do it, this is exactly the lines you have to follow. They're saying this is the area of concern. Now please provide us with a sign that you're making a best effort, whatever that best effort may be. And that's not very well defined. So if we're looking at the GDPR topic as a whole, it is about, and you can read for yourself, it has a complete perspective on everything, such as record keeping, impact assessments, the right setup on how you actually create your internal processes, how you monitor them, how you select your employees, how you onboard them, all of these things. So you basically need to review all your processes, all your infrastructure, all your technology, and pretty much anywhere where you store any kind of data, including potentially the private accounts or the private storage facilities used by your employees if you previously allowed them to. So you have way more obligations now for the data protection officer office, if you like. So where this has previously not always been in many companies a dedicated office, now you need to appoint someone who's actually going to be held liable. And frankly, I wouldn't envy these people for their job, because that's very, very tricky in the current situation. Given the magnitude of the potential penalties, this is almost a hot seat, isn't it? And the data portability rights and deletion rights are very, very tricky to install, because how do you make sure that none of your old records keep any of the data that you're supposed to port somewhere else? And how do you then make sure that you can prove to someone that you have deleted all his information? That is still still unanswered in very large areas. So the increase in individual rights and the obligations from the processor side are massive. So what does it mean? What are the key new requirements? As I said before, you now need a data protection officer. So you need to set up a role dedicated for data protection. And we have seen that being done sometimes within the CIO office. We have seen that being done very much like a chief data officer by someone else on the side, along the side. We think that given the magnitude of the task right now, maybe that'll be different in 3 or 4 years' time, but right now that is probably in most of the global 2000 companies, that would be a dedicated role with not only one person, but actually a team of people working on that to be compliant by May next year. Then the data breach notification is something that you need to show proactively that you are able to conduct or execute a data breach notification to the authorities. So that is a mandatory requirement where you need to have processes and the systems again in place to make sure that you can notify folks. And then of course the stricter harmonized approach to consent and notice around the new individual rights, the rights to rectification, restrict object erasure, and data portability. That means also that anywhere where the information is used, where algorithms or any kind of mathematical, statistical sort of mechanics are involved in the aggregation of data and the conclusion in terms of how much somebody will get within your organization in terms of credit. How are you going to rate someone? How are you going to interact with someone? Whether he gets a premium line access or the regular line access, and all these kinds of decisions can now be questioned by every individual. And you need to, or everyone from May onwards needs to be able to explain precisely what the mechanics behind the algorithms look like. They will have to justify every single component of the algorithm and explain it in layman's terms so that everybody understands it, and then everybody that understands it can object to parts or the whole, and then you have to come up with an alternative means of recalculating these algorithms or these mechanics that lead you to a certain conclusion as far as this particular individual is concerned. which leads to a complete new set of transparency requirements way above and beyond simple data measurement or data visibility or any of that. If you're using any sort of classification inside your organization to raster and classify and categorize folks, and they're not happy with it, then you're on the hook to actually prove that you have done your best, delivered your best effort to make sure to satisfy that individual's requirements. If that individual says he wants, for example, his gender, his or her gender not to be displayed in any of your systems, then you need to have the master data management capabilities in place to make sure that his or her gender is erased or restricted anywhere where he has advised you that, or she has advised you that they want it to be the case. So it's not just about, you know, creating one plan and implementing it. It's about object level, not just security, but amendability. And that object level amendability, if you like, expands to the to any kind of formula and classification, and that makes it quite interesting. Now, you are going to be held accountable, and you will have to, every one of us, that includes ourselves, of course, as well, will be held accountable to actually keep all the records to prove that they, as a company, made the best possible effort to get this going and to be compliant with the GDPR requirements. This, again, presents quite a few challenges, especially for big data, because you already have way more data. Most of us have way more data than we can currently deal with. Now, if we need to keep all of that data and almost keep it infinitely, and not just a limited subset, but actually everything that touches on customers or individuals, not just in Europe, but above and beyond, then this is going to be a potential nightmare, but a nightmare that we have to solve by May. The data protection impact assessments are one set of components that are required by everyone. So the actual impact on a company and what it means and how it has to change are fundamental to prove that you had made your best effort to the regulatory bodies. If you can't show these impact assessments and then the willingness to learn on what has to happen next and how you're planning to change, then this itself might already be considered a breach. Now, this is a huge requirement, and we believe that, albeit this already being quite a huge requirement, we believe that one should go above and beyond and voluntarily disclose potential areas of concern and voluntarily suggest ideas on how GDPR can be improved. We think that the company that takes GDPR by its horns and not just looks at the problems that occur from the GDPR requirements, but actually helps through these assessments, impact assessments, above and beyond, almost create a GDPR 2.0 and help the regulators to come up with ideas on how this can be further improved. We think there's a huge opportunity. So conducting these impact assessments, not just so that they're looking at the current status quo, but actually looking at future possibilities and, frankly, future risk, and voluntarily disclosing this and making suggestions how this can be improved, we think is the way forward in terms of making sure that everybody, and specifically the regulators, will be happy. And then the obligations on the data processors, whoever processes any sort of data, you know, these obligations around standards, around processes, around visibility, portability, restrictions, etc., apply to any data processors, of course, as well. So the potential pathway to GDPR compliance, just to highlight a few thoughts there for you, the global privacy program pillars, as we define them, are the building privacy awareness, building privacy into your processes, then creating an incident response, first aid kit, as we put it there, then the governance structures, and then supporting the sustainable growth. So for us, this is all foundation. This is all put on the foundation for data governance and the gap analysis. And even so, you might say, we have a lot of data, we have a lot of information, we have a lot of formulas, we have a lot of existing processes, and all the above is true. The actual gap analysis between what you currently have and coming up with a plan to deal with it is actually not a humongous effort. It is an effort that typically that is our team, conduct in weeks rather than months. On rare occasions, months, if a company is very, very data heavy for the B2 in the B2C space. So, for example, I know we have guests today here from a big European telecom. So, if you're a telecom, yes, it's not a trivial effort. But if you are a large-ish company that primarily deals with B2B and then has some private data, some personal data stored as well, then this is a very doable effort, and we're talking rather weeks than months. Especially the awareness bit. All of these components are basically components you need to address, and you need to have some sort of documentation that you can show to an assessor whether you've actually tried to be compliant and made your best effort. So the plans are as important as the execution of the processes later. And as nobody has any experience right now with the exact execution of the processes and what they should look like, the plans right now are the first hurdle to get right and are the foundation for sound sleep at night, again, if you like. So I hope this makes any sense. And again, if you have any questions, please put it up into the chat box, and we're happy to respond to them at the end. So this gives you a little bit of an overview, and I'm happy to share the slides. We're happy to share the slides with you if you want to see some examples, if you want to see some examples around what role-based training could look like, for example. We're happy to provide you with some input there. So these are the pillars. Happy to share the presentation later on with you, so you can use this pretty much as a checkbox as your typical architecture map. And then in the privacy and compliance structure, we obviously have the various roles which are rather well specified that you then have to comply with. You actually have to create and set up. And as I said before, it's not just the data privacy officer, but it's a data privacy officer team, the data privacy officer network, which works throughout the organization. And yes, they don't all have to be full-term data privacy officers, but or data privacy lieutenants or what have you. They can just be divisional heads that also are assigned data privacy officer network members to then take that on their heads to actually raise the privacy awareness and support, as well as become the go-to guys for any questions that their employees might have. Then the privacy project teams within the data privacy office, they are the ones that then create the strategy and advise on what can be done and what shouldn't be done. And you then have them being overseen by the steering committee that's made up of the data privacy officers, but also consists of some senior level folks inside the organization, all of which will be sponsored typically by either the CEO, CFO, or CIO, as we see it happening most of the time. And then, of course, the board needs to take this into account in their overall strategy to make sure that the strategy, the strategic objectives, the KPIs for the various department heads, for the various members of the various teams need to reflect the data privacy requirements as from May onwards. And there is, by the way, just so I've said it, there is no harm in trying to be compliant earlier than May, because then you can still make a few errors and mistakes and actually run this by the regulators or have this stress tested by someone like ourselves to see whether it's now working and to get ready for May, when it then all gets serious. So I hope this gave you a little bit of an idea around what the various components of GDPR compliance are. Let me go back here again, the program pillars, and what the compliance structure should look like. Now, obviously, we are in the business of helping others, so it is very much in our interest to consult you on that. We're happy to give you a little bit more insight, of course, if you want to see whether we can set up something like this, but above and beyond that, obviously we would appreciate anyone that asks for our help. So I've put a few more slides and then we're done with the general overview. I put a few more slides in there because I think it's not quite sorted by just having a GDPR compliance. I think there are some longer term implications, and there are some other thoughts to be had. Now, because we're not just working in RegTech, we're not just working in FinTech, we're not just working on that data side, we're also working on a couple of groundbreaking blockchain and cognitive projects. We have seen over the last few months a severe shift to handing the data back to the originators. Whereas a few weeks or months ago or a few years ago, you had no conversation whatsoever around who owns what kind of data. When the smart meters came into power in the UK, none of the regulatory bodies, none of the organizing bodies actually cared at all around where the data came from and who might potentially own them. All they thought about was the mechanics behind smart metering switching capabilities to increase more competition in the market. And it's quite embarrassing that someone like us had to come along and say, guys, by the way, who owned the data? Who is the steward of the data? Who manages? Who can admin information? And there was no answer. The same thing applies in many different areas, and I don't want to NHS bash, but in the NHS, for example, one of the biggest concerns is that data is just freely given away to third parties. Patient data, sensitive data is given away to third parties, and very often patients never hear about it until they get some advertisement from a pharmaceutical company or some hospital. So the way how it's currently being dealt with, we think is severely unsustainable. We think is very short-sighted. So the way forward, in our opinion, will be actually more handing over of power back to the individuals that create data, to allow them to also monetize on their data. And we think it is paramount for any kind of organization to have an ethical standard and approach to make sure that the social responsibility is a part of their long-term plans, and the social responsibility also reflects data requirements. If that's the case, then we think any company is well set up for a GDPR 2.0, which will come, and it'll come into effect probably 2 or 3 years, not much later after the first GDPR will have been released, because there will be loopholes and areas of concern that haven't been addressed with the first iteration. So we think that this data generator, steward, custodian, manager rules, users, what are they allowed to do? All these things will be solved probably in that next generation, but it doesn't hurt to already now think about it, to set that up as roles inside an organization and help regulators to say, we're not just showing you that we're actually got our ducks in a row, but we're showing you that we have thought further, we have the right attitude towards data, and this is our approach and how we want to deal with data. So we think this is very important to actually have this set up already today or within the next few weeks and months. So ideally, as I said before, in the future, individuals can get a dashboard, can get into their own data sets, can look at their own data sets, and can make that self-serving. If you want, and if you're having lots of customer data, and customers will be educated, I guarantee towards the end of the year, will be educated by all sorts of service companies in what they can request and what they can demand from large organizations. When that happens, and you have one call center with 100 people, these 100 people will be busy taking customer calls all the time around, where's my data, what do you do with my data, why do you use this algorithm, why didn't I get my credit check passed, etc., etc., etc. So if you don't have a dashboard that allows individuals to go and self-service, we think this is going to be a problem. And ultimately, it'll be beneficial for the individuals, because they will get the feeling of, well, they will be just very happy customers. We think that obviously, because we're a bit biased, because we're dealing a lot with blockchain technology and distributed ledger technology, we think that this will be at the heart of a future marketplace model, a future data-driven model where people will be individually able to manage and monetize potentially even their data. So we think that blockchain DLT will be at the heart, and we're seeing the first information, the first examples already crop up and then come to life. And if you'd like to have some examples, we're happy to share some examples with you. And lastly, we think that through this blockchain technology, the disintermediation will continue to take place, and the foundation for true democratization will be there in a few months' time as well. So that's just a few closing remarks. And like I said before, if you have any questions, we're happy to take them now. And I'm just looking through the list. And of course, there's one question here around data portability. So data portability basically means that you need to make best effort to provide the data set that you have for the individual that is requesting his data to be ported. And that means any kind of data that you have for this individual, you will need to make available. And that if, for example, if you're a telecom, that means geodata. That means any data. That means customer data. That means everything. If you are an energy company, that means consumption data. That means bank data. That means any kind of data. Now, not everyone wants to always port all of the data over, specifically if they, for example, have been a bad customer, they haven't paid their bills in time or whatever, they might want to retract some of the data. Then they can decide to get some of the data retracted and get the rest ported. But you need to make sure that you, when you port the data and it's requested to have a deletion afterwards, that you port the retracted version of the data and then delete. And then you actually need to store the fact that you have deleted that data and actually make it available to a regulator at any point in time, which doesn't make it a lot easier, and again is part of the reason why we think that blockchain or DLT technology will be at the heart of it in the future, because there you could create a self-service portal for the regulators to look at the information and to look at the process in all the various action items that have been completed and have complete visibility to all of these things that have been done. But it is an area of big concern. And we have one more question around what kind of blockchain technologies we think we could use there. So there is no particular blockchain technology that would be the best one, but we believe, in general, we believe in open source. So, and we have seen many successful open source projects in the past. We have, so in the blockchain world, we have Ethereum, we have Hyperledger, which is somewhat open, and we have a DLT technology called Corda. So we have a whole bunch of open source, open standard approaches which one could deploy. And it's just important to note as a final note, and then let's stop brabbling on about blockchain, that actually the coding isn't the hard work. And of course, coders would disagree with me, but I think from what I've seen, we think from what we've seen, that coding isn't the hard work to make some ragtag work. It is actually the integrating of the processes of the future with your old school processes and making sure that this then works, and this then works differently, and that requires an understanding throughout the organization, which is very much capability, and if you want to add skills to capability, skills driven, that requires a different kind of thinking, and that is, for a largish institution, the bigger effort than the pure coding of or setup of a distributed ledger that allows anyone to self-serve the information about GDPR compliance. So we have a few more, but I think we have exhausted our welcome here. So I hope given you some first information around what it is that that we think is hot on the trot. Again, I apologize for Belinda not being able to be here. Belinda has created the slides, and I hope I did her justice by giving a good introduction. You can get in touch with Belinda, by the way, via our website, fintricity.com, and then just click on her LinkedIn profile, or you can send me an email, and I'm happy to forward the information or the information request or the question to Belinda. And if you have any more specific questions, then we'd be delighted to help you. Here you can contact us on Twitter, on Facebook, and anywhere else that I think our marketing has properly taken care of. So thank you very much for your attention, everybody. It was a pleasure talking to you all, and I'd be delighted if we could have a follow-up conversation at some point in time, ideally due course. So have a great day, and thanks again for attending, and talk to you soon. Thank you. Bye.